everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for Ask the Expert North Texas. I'm Kristin Diaz.
David Rancken. Every year at this time, Apple commands the attentions of millions of people. That's because this is the time of year when it comes out with new iPhones and Apple Watches, and today is no different. Apple announced the iPhone 15 and the newest Apple Watch. On today's Ask the Expert, we are joined by our tech expert, Ian Sherr. He is in the KRLD Zoom room. Ian, thanks so much for the time.
Thanks for having me.
So why is it we are so fascinated with what's coming out in iPhone world every year? It used to be we would line up outside Apple stores for the chance to be the first to get the new iPhone. It hasn't done that, but we're still fascinated.
Well, to be fair, I think if Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, were sitting here with us, he would tell you that actually sales are higher than when people used to line up. And I think a lot of that is because we've gotten used to ordering online. It's, I bought something today, it's going to be shipped to my house. In a lot of ways, that experience has changed dramatically. But I think people are still interested, and the data shows that they are. And part of it is that Apple really, it's gotten kind of boring to say, but they really do lead the tech industry in a lot of ways. They come up with new designs, new ideas, and they also integrate a lot of disparate ideas from around the tech industry in really interesting ways. And iPhone is a great example of it, right? The touchscreen was something that did exist before the iPhone, but Apple came up with a way to make it really interesting and revolutionize the entire industry. And that is why we all keep watching, is partially because they're behemoth, right? They're one of the most profitable companies in the world. They are one of the most powerful companies in the world. So you got to watch them just because the center of gravity is there, but also because they might do something that suddenly will change whether or not you buy Apple stuff, will change how you use devices. And these are some of the most personal products that we carry, right? How many other things do we carry with us everywhere we go all the time, including into the restroom and to dinner and everywhere else? This is a really important thing.
Absolutely. But you know what, Ian, there are some people who are going to say, these events are always the same thing. The phone looks the same. It does the same stuff. What, for anybody who is, denying or didn't want to tune in for the event, what really peeked out to you as a tech expert to convince people this is actually something that's pretty cool?
Yeah, every year Apple really tries to have some tentpole thing to point at. So, for example, over the last couple of years, they've started putting in satellite connectivity into their phones. And this is actually really fascinating. They were the first real big phone maker to start offering this, where if you are outside of cellular service, right, there's no cell service at all, you can still actually try to call 911 and your phone will tell you, there's no cell service. But if you point me, right, the phone, toward where a satellite is, and it's able to actually tell you where to point, then you'll be able to send a short message to the authorities or to your friends to tell them where you are on a GPS map or something. And it's already saved a number of lives. So now this year, they've not just done, okay, you can text for just if your car ran off the road. There's actually someone in California, I think it is, who went off of a cliff and survived, and they then used their phone to call for help. But now also they're going to start doing AAA roadside assistance through this service. So, imagine you're in the middle of, the highway in Texas, you're really rural, and there is no cell service. There's plenty of experiences there. You'll still be able to get help with changing your tire or getting some extra gas if you're in trouble. So that's a really interesting thing where Apple, I think, is trying to say, this is not just a cool looking new device. It's not just nifty. It's not just for playing games or taking photos of kids, although all those things are fun. But also it's actually something that can give you a little bit of peace of mind, which is where Apple really seems to be getting a lot of resonance lately.
But again, there's nothing really groundbreaking in this year's newest iPhone. When's the last time there had been something actually that changed the whole landscape of smartphones?
Yeah, other than the first one, right, the first iPhone, which really changed everything, I think part of what's been really fascinating and frustrating for a lot of people is that Apple takes this very incremental approach to everything they do. right? And what happens is that instead of possibly trying to throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and then see what sticks and keep that for the next year, or try to throw a bunch of stuff at the wall every year, which is what some companies do. Apple really tries to home in on those couple features that will help sell the devices. And if you don't buy every year, which, increasingly, most of us are holding onto our phones 3-4 years now, then you're going to feel a big difference when you go from 3 years ago to today. And that is where Apple's really making their bets, right? It's like, yeah, if you bought an iPhone 14, you probably don't need Ambien tonight because you're just going to hear about what the new iPhone is. And other than the cameras, there isn't much to talk about. So you'll be able to go to sleep. But if you have an iPhone from 3-4 years ago, the difference in the cameras alone is enormous. And I know it feels like that's always something that people say, but it's pretty significant. And I think that's part of why it feels like it's boring every year, but then for some reason they always sell well.
I think that's always so fascinating, right? The fact that the camera can get so much better every single time. Because I think about I still have like my old flip phone from like high school, and I'm like, oh my gosh, you can take pictures on this thing. I can't even make out what it was anymore. Like our eyes have been so sharpened, with these images, right? And we've trained how to see these images in a whole different way. So I think that's always funny. But as far as not maybe buying a phone because you needed an upgrade after a couple of years, you like the iPhone, you want to stay with that. Let's talk about also the watch. The watch is also something that not everyone has, but I know people who do have it are usually pretty loyal to it.
They are. And this is part of where Apple it doesn't have much competition at all, right? Samsung is trying, but generally speaking, Apple has really just run roughshod over the watch industry. It's like they did with tablets, right? There really aren't competing tablets. There are ones sold by other companies, but nobody's really buying unless it's an iPad. And with the Apple Watch, I think what's really interesting is that this year they said, okay, how do we continue to innovate? They're now at year, I think, 9 or 10. How do we keep this being interesting? And one of the things that they did was that they said, okay, we're going to really focus on the environmental conversation, right? Because one of the things that, the data is undeniable. Generation Z, Generation Alpha, right? The people who are starting to have some spendable income, we can debate all of these things and whether they'll ever be able to buy houses and stuff. But, those people are starting to make purchasing decisions. And Apple is really pushing hard on the fact that this year, they say every single one of the watches they sell is carbon neutral across the board. The manufacturing, the energy that you even use, they take some of the profits out of the watch and they invest it toward environmental projects, which they say offset your energy usage. And so all of these things are kind of something that Apple said, we're going to really push on that. And, I applaud them for it, right? They're talking about like most of the titanium in the expensive watches is now recycled. The aluminum is 100% recycled. The batteries are recycled. The copper is, it's crazy how much they've gotten into this. But by the way, a lot of it being done there in Austin. But I think it's really interesting where Apple's trying to push the stuff.
Yeah, that was a big part of the whole center of the conversation. They brought in Octavia Spencer to play Mother Nature, and they got to brag on what they're able to do. But to the consumer, really, does it really matter?
I think, again, this is one of those things where if you're not tuned into this because you're not part of the generation that really has an existential fear of what the planet is going to become, then you may not be as aware of this. But there is so much polling data out there, and there is so much purchasing data that it's not even a debate, right? It is a smart thing for any company to lean into this stuff, which is why we have things like the word greenwashing, right? Where companies kind of fake a lot of their efforts to make environmentalism better, but they're not actually doing much, or it's just PR. And Apple actually, to their credit, made fun of that a little bit, right? And even had Octavia Spencer in a video today making, kind of criticizing them, saying, well, all companies, every year they say they're doing something. But Apple says that what they're doing is actually really meaningful. And they're starting to put up data that at least is something that we all can parse through and decide for ourselves, rather than the company saying, oh yeah, we put a bunch of money into reforesting the Amazon and supporting the mangroves and all these other things which sound right, but then we don't actually know what they mean. Apple seems to really be trying to home in on how do we tell you and show you that we're doing it, which I give them credit for.
Absolutely. I was curious, a couple of years ago, and you would know the details far better than I would, but a couple of years ago, I do remember Apple was coming out with the smaller version of these phones. They were like multiple colors. They were kind of geared towards like if your kid wanted to have a phone, you wouldn't have to dish out nearly $1,200 for their first phone or something like that. Is that still a thing that they're pursuing?
Yes.
Because I think they're not cheap.
Well, none of the phones are cheap, right? But to be fair, even the candy bar Nokia phones that we had, 2 decades ago also were not cheap. But the reality is that Apple has been selling this thing called the iPhone SE for a very long time, right? And it starts around $400. I forgot the exact number. But what it does is it actually is kind of one of the older phones. It doesn't have as nice a screen, and it doesn't have as nice a camera, but otherwise the internals are almost identical to some of the newer phones. And so they're able to actually kind of sell this device and say, look, we're not, some of the most expensive parts of the phone are the screen and the cameras. So if we take those out, we can give you all the savings. And they've become pretty popular devices, particularly, as you point out, for starter phones. Also, it's really interesting. USA Today and the Washington Post and the Today Show have really talked a lot about how Apple Watches have become one of the new popular starter phone experiences because they can't run TikTok, which a lot of parents like to know, but they still have the cellular connectivity, GPS, all those important things. So there's actually an Apple Watch SE, right? Again, cheaper edition, essentially, made for that purpose. It has cellular built in, and it is offered for that really low price comparatively to try and convince you. And by the way, it too now is carbon neutral. So once again, Apple's kind of playing to both of those things, right? The younger generation caring about the environment, and also the parents not wanting to dish out too much.
Let's talk about one thing. You brought Samsung up earlier in the chat, and one thing that Samsung came up with this year is improving on and expanding on their foldable options. Yeah. Is Apple ever going to come up with an iPhone that's foldable? That seems to be the next great thing for them, I would guess.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels like it is the future. And part of the reason, by the way, is that Sci-Fi has been talking about folding technology forever, right? I mean, the classic flip phone is actually, modeled in part after Captain Kirk's communicator in Star Trek from 1966. So, there's a lot of stuff that there's kind of there's this push that is constantly happening to make devices kind of fold up, smaller, easier to carry around. So Apple has been reported to be working on folding phones, but part of what they struggle with, and by the way, Samsung too, is that they're still very fragile. And you look at the ads that Apple has now, they actually advertise people dropping their phones into like puddles and dropping them on the ground and then picking them up and going like, oh, it's fine. And they talk about how the screen is really able to take a beating nowadays. Those are things that the folding phones can't handle. So for Apple, they'd have to kind of walk back a little bit of that, oh, our phones are really rugged type of approach if they were to do that, which I think is part of why. The other thing also is that statistically, there's still not that much of a market. They're growing, right? The folding phones is becoming popular, but they start at $1,000. It's a lot to ask most people. So, Apple is really not going for that kind of market yet, I think.
So we know the technology of the actual phone, but we still haven't heard of the actual operating system that is soon to come, right?
Yeah. Well, so we actually do. So it's called iOS 17 is the new software that will power all these new phones. And Apple actually announced it in the summer, and they've had test versions of the software available. In fact, if you are really ambitious and also, willing to put up with a couple of bucks, you can download it today. But what it does is that it offers a lot of kind of new fun features, especially within the messaging app. It makes it a lot more feel like how a lot of the messaging apps online are. Like, if you use Messenger or WhatsApp or stuff like that, a lot of the features that were easy from there have been translated over. Some of the other things they've also done is they've remade the way a lot of these things feel so that they're easier to use. And probably one of the more important things they've done is that they've really kicked up the security. Apple is always advertising itself as one of the more secure people out there. And they are increasing the amount of security they've built in to actually reduce tracking by Facebook and Google and all this stuff. So those things are all going to be, by the way, available for free for everyone who already has an iPhone made in the last few years. That's going to come out next week for all of them.
Ian Sherr is our tech expert. Ian, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.